Welcome back into the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap, presented by Full Press Coverage. Yes, we're in the doldrums of summer. It seems like basketball is a million miles away as football is really gearing up. Baseball trade deadline just passed. And so, yeah, sometimes you can't find NBA news, but other times people take care of that for you, Sap, and they make news out of nothing. And that's what we got from an NBA legend this past week, as Dr. J was doing an interview, and he decided to list his top 10 of all time, and that set NBA Twitter, or NBA X. I'm never going to call it X, by the way, Sap. It's just going to be Twitter. It set it ablaze.
It sure did, right? And I'm here to defend the doctor for the most part, okay? So
I know you're not, because your guy was left off the list, so you're going to get mad.
Well, there were two giant omissions on the list, obviously. But, okay, here's what happened. Dr. J's in an interview, and he's asked to name his all-time top 10 list. He doesn't do it in any order. He just names 10 players. Now, the first five he mentioned were Jerry West, Oscar Robertson, Elgin Baylor, Will Chamberlain, Bill Russell. Those are five players Dr. J grew up idolizing. Dr. J was born in 1950s. Those five guys, clearly the five greatest players of the first 25 years of the NBA. I mean, I don't even know who would be number six. Would it be George Mikan or Bob Pettit, who feel
one of those two.
Historic. Yeah. Right. And those guys are prehistoric compared to the five that Dr. J named. So I have no problem with those five players because I think they're all top 10 worthy. Now, Chamberlain and Russell, clearly top 10. I have Baylor, Robertson, and West just outside my top 10, but you can make a case that they're top 10 worthy. So those five, I think he nailed. I'm going to bet any amount of money that Elgin Baylor was Dr. J's idol growing up because Elgin Baylor was the first player that made the game vertical. Elgin Baylor led you to Dr. J, who led you to Michael Jordan. So those five, I'm right on board with. Now, his next five, a little bit problematic.
Yeah. That's where it starts to get a little off the rails.
Only 40% of it, though, because, again, he named Kareem.
Yeah,
Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson.
Yeah, no problem. Great.
Those guys are clearly top 10 players. Now it gets off the rails. So he names Tiny Archibald, who was a great player, the only player in league history to lead the league in scoring and assists in the same season. And then he names Karl Malone, who I have at number 20. So I wouldn't put Karl Malone in my top 10 discussion, but I think he's the 20th greatest player of all time. So he's not that far away from being top 10. The one that set Twitter, X, or whatever ablaze was, what the hell is he putting Tiny Archibald in his top 10? Here's the thing. Those guys grew up together in New York. They were friends. They played on the playground together. They remained friends. So he put his friend on the list. And you know what, Dr. J, 73. Sometimes when you get older, you say, screw it. I'm going to put my friend on the list because I still love him. Karl Malone, I think that just kind of slipped in because you look at Malone's numbers, durability, longevity, consistency, great player. The issues I have with both of those players, first of all, Dr. J played with a player who was a contemporary of Karl Malone's, who I think is slightly better than Karl Malone. That's Charles Barkley. But Barkley, Karl Malone, and Tiny Archibald do not belong on anyone's top 10 list. The two biggest omissions, Larry Bird and LeBron James. Now, Larry Bird was a fierce rival of Dr. J's for 10 years. They never liked each other. And again, Dr. J, 73 years old, said, you know what? I don't like the guy. I'm not putting him on my list. And as far as LeBron James, there's a lot of pushback from older players about LeBron James because they think he's had it easy. He's picked his spots to go from team to team to team to win championships. And also, whether you think LeBron James is the greatest player or second greatest player or third greatest player in the history of the sport, I think he's the greatest player ever, but most people put him at one or number two. You cannot debate that he's the most influential and powerful player off the court in terms of how the league is run.
You certainly can't leave him off your top 10.
And you also can't leave him off your top 10 list if he's, by all accounts, at least the second best player ever. But the old guys push back against LeBron because they think he's had it too easy and he is so influential. He might as well be Adam Silver's co-commissioner. Nothing gets done in the league without his stamp of approval. So I think the older guys want to push back against LeBron just out of jealousy. And also during that interview, the person who was conducting the interview first brought up Steph Curry, which again is another name that is top 10 worthy, but she should have known better and said, well, what about Larry Bird and LeBron James? We're both better than Steph Curry. And Dr. J said, well, Steph Curry hasn't played long enough. Steph Curry's played 15 years. I know he's still playing, but I think Steph Curry and LeBron James are certainly top 10 worthy if they never play another game. So the issues with Dr. J's top 10 list, certainly Tiny Archibald and Karl Malone, it should have been Larry Bird and LeBron James.
Yeah, and Sap, if he's trying to cover some of his bases, saying, he continued saying, everybody I named on my list, their career is finished. So LeBron's obviously still playing, even though everybody knows if he retired 5 seasons ago, he'd still be a top 10 player of all time. So that's irrelevant. But fine, if he wants to do, players whose careers are over, and so then LeBron isn't on the list yet, but because he's still playing, not because he doesn't deserve a place there. Larry Bird, like you said, obviously a glaring omission. But I also, you mentioned pushing back on Karl Malone in favor of a power forward that he played with. What about another guy whose last name was Malone that he played with? I think Moses Malone is a better all-time player than Karl Malone, in my opinion, Sap.
Absolutely, without question. Yeah, he could have put him on there. Now, I think he was trying to field a team, right? Like a center, 2 forwards, and 2 guards. He did that with his first 5. He moved Russell over to power forward, who, if Bill Russell was playing today, would probably be a power forward because he was 6'9". So I think when he put together his second 5, he was looking at it, okay, Magic and Jordan would be my backcourt, although Tiny Archibald was 6'1", clearly a point guard. And then he puts Karl Malone and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar up there up until LeBron James surpassed both of them. They were the 2 leading scorers in NBA history. Yeah, I think Moses Malone certainly better than Karl Malone. The exercise I think Dr. J should have done, and I think more people should do, is build a 5-man team from different eras, right? I think the league is 76 years old, and I put this on Twitter at JohnSapp25 if you want to go there and vote. The first 25 years of the league, the first 5 names he mentioned, that's your team, right? West, Oscar Robertson, Elgin Baylor, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, no-brainer. The middle 25 years of the league, I think your starting 5 would be Kareem, Magic, Jordan, Larry Bird, and Dr. J himself. I have Dr. J as the 15th greatest player of all time because I include what he accomplished in the ABA, where he won 3 league MVPs and 2 titles in the ABA. And look, Jet, from the early 70s till the merger in 76, the ABA was every bit as good as the NBA. You had Dr. J, George McGinnis, George Gervin, David Thompson, Moses Malone, Artis Gilmore. I can continue to name all-time great players. So I have to put his accomplishments from the ABA in there. The debate of who was the best player of the 70s is Kareem and Julius Erving. So I would put that as my starting 5 in terms of the middle 25 years of the league. The most recent 25 years of the league, I also think is pretty easy. It's Steph Curry, Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Tim Duncan, and Shaquille O'Neal. To me, those 15 guys are the 15 greatest players ever. And on my poll at JohnSapp25, I asked if you had a round-robin tournament, who would win? Who do you think would win if you took those 3 teams, put them in a round-robin tournament? Again, obviously, all in their prime, playing within somewhat similar rules. Who do you think would win a round-robin tournament? Team A, Team B, or Team C?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great poll question. There's kind of no wrong answer. I mean, obviously, you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit because, the athleticism level is increased with each of those generations, right? And so you would say, okay, well, the most recent generation is probably the biggest, strongest, fastest, but maybe the oldest generation had the best fundamentals. So I don't know, Sap. There's really, that's why it's so fun is you can debate it endlessly. Going back to Dr. J's list too, I mean, you and I agree on this. We're both big Tim Duncan fans. I don't see any way, shape, or form how anybody could argue that Karl Malone had a better career, was a better player than Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan, yes, was 7 feet tall, but he primarily did play power forward. I just don't see how there's an argument to be made to put Malone ahead of Duncan, and their careers did overlap. So that one is baffling to me, and certainly Kobe Bryant over Tiny Archibald. No disrespect to Tiny Archibald, but Kobe Bryant just as much to me head and shoulders above Tiny Archibald as Tim Duncan is head and shoulders above Karl Malone.
Without question. And back to that poll question, I would pick Team B because you'd have Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan in the backcourt, you'd have Larry Bird and Dr. J at forward, Kareem at center. So you would have Michael Jordan, the greatest perimeter scorer and arguably the greatest perimeter defender in the history of the sport, leading the way. You have Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the most unstoppable shot in the history of the sport, the sky hook. You would have Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, who were essentially Swiss Army knives, right? They could pass, rebound, score. They were underrated defenders. And then you had Dr. J, who's a marvelous all-around player. Just think of that starting five coming down the court on a fast break with Magic down the middle, Jordan on one wing, Dr. J on another wing, and Bird trailing it for an open three. My Lord, that would be dangerous. I also think that on that team, you have four of the seven greatest players in the history of the sport, and Michael Jordan, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird. I have those four guys in my top seven. I think that team would be pretty difficult to beat. But just think about the individual matchups you'd have, right? You'd have Shaq against Wilt. I mean, that would be incredible to watch. You'd have Jordan and Kobe going head-to-head, two sociopaths on the basketball court. LeBron against Elgin Baylor or Larry Bird. I mean, the matchups would be fascinating and endless. But, yeah, the Tiny Archibald one, and again, I think Tiny's a top 50 player. You know, it's not like this guy was a bum. He's an all-time great player, but not a top 10 player.
No, that's the thing is, Sep, when you get into the top 10, you're talking like there's no margin for error. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the top 10. It seems like you're slighting other players when you're not slighting them. It's just that it gets very, you have to really nitpick, Sap, when you're talking about the top 10, right? Like any lesser accomplishments or lesser championships, lesser statistics, lesser seasons played or stuff like that. You have to look at everything if you're talking about a top 10. It doesn't mean you're not saying a player's great, but that's the most rarefied air in sports, in any sport, if you're talking about top 10 list of all time, but especially in basketball, Sap, where we have such a litany of not just statistical data, but championship accomplishments and players who have done that. You really just the slightest thing that is left off your resume knocks you off the top 10, and it can knock you off the top 20 too.
Sure. I mean, if we're going to compile the 10 greatest quarterbacks of the Super Bowl era and someone drops in Phillip Rivers, we're going to say, hold on a second, you know, because there's Brady and Montana and Manning and Elway and Rodgers and Mahomes, and I could go on and on and on and get to 10 pretty quickly, and Phillip Rivers might be at like number 25. If someone put Phillip Rivers as a top 10 quarterback of the Super Bowl era, we'd say this list just doesn't make any sense. So, again, I think a lot of this was personal. Dr. J doesn't like Larry Bird. He's close friends with Tiny Archibald, so he puts Tiny Archibald on the list. And I think the older players, there's a lot of pushback against LeBron James because they look at him and say, this guy had it easier than we did. We never ran the league the way LeBron runs the league right now, so we're going to keep him off that list. And I think that's the mentality that Dr. J had in this. But again, 8 of his 10 choices I'm on board with, even though I don't have Elgin Baylor, Oscar Robertson, and Jerry West in my top 10. But they're in my top 15, so they're not that far off.
Yeah, I think that's, I don't think that those are unreasonable. I think that Malone and Archibald are obviously just unreasonable, that no sane person would have them in their top 10. It doesn't make any logical sense when you talk about the players that you're omitting there. There's a lot of players that I would put ahead of, Archibald, and then there's still a decent amount of players I'd put ahead of Karl Malone. Not saying they're not both top 50 players. To me, they are both top 50 players, but to me, nowhere near top 10 all-time players. And then I don't know if you saw this, Sap, that Shaq a couple days later responded with his top 10 list. Did you hear? Did you see that one? So here's what Shaq had for his top 10 list: Magic Johnson, Kobe Bryant, Michael Jordan, LeBron James, and himself. Was his first team, and then his second team was Steph Curry, Allen Iverson, Tim Duncan, Isaiah Thomas, and Karl Malone.
Yeah, a lot of love for Karl Malone. Like, I wouldn't put Allen Iverson or Karl Malone on my list. We've already talked about Karl Malone. Allen Iverson, to me, is pretty comparable to Tiny Archibald. Maybe a little bit better because he did win a league MVP. But Tiny Archibald also played at a time when strictly centers were winning MVPs because the players voted for MVP and they always selected a center. They would never pick a guard to be MVP. So to me, Tiny Archibald, Allen Iverson, pretty comparable as players. I think Isaiah Thomas better than both. I think that was an interesting choice. But again, where's Larry Bird? Did people not have cable TV in the 80s? And even if you were a young man,
it's a weird omission.
Is it because the guy was white? Like, I'm not trying to be flip here, but
I think
he was phenomenal. I mean, I saw, I'm being assertive here, probably 300 of his games live. I mean, I was covering the team in the 80s. I was at pretty much every home game, regular season, and playoffs. There were points in his career where he was clearly the best player in the sport, and that was a sport that had Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Dr. J, Michael Jordan. He was the best player for a 3, 4, 5 year period. He won 3 straight MVPs. He was toying with the opposition on many nights. In an 8-year stretch, Jet, he finished first or second in MVP voting, 8 straight years. Like, that's incredible. Like, how do you leave Larry Bird off the list? It's almost like he's the forgotten guy. It almost feels a little bit like Mickey Mantle in baseball, and people forget how great Mickey Mantle was. And I never saw him play. I'm not that old. I mean, I'm old. But I think it's because the last impression you have of Mickey Mantle was a broken down player. Larry Bird, his last few years with the Celtics, you remember him sitting on the sideline on his stomach because his back was so bad. His final month as a player was with the Dream Team in 1992, and he was just kind of along for the ride. It was more about Magic and Jordan and Barkley and all those great players. It was more ceremonial that Larry Bird was on that team. He wasn't a great player anymore. He was still pretty darn good that year when he averaged 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 6 assists in what was obviously a down year for a decrepit old guy. I don't know why people wouldn't put him on that list. He's clearly a top 10 player. You can make a case a top 5 player if you're talking pro or post merger, right? Because I know a lot of people want to look at it and say, okay, how do we possibly look at Russell and Chamberlain and compare them to other eras when they were just physically so much better than everyone else? Like, in terms of all around breadth of skill, Larry Bird's one of the 5 greatest players in the history of sport. In my opinion, you've got Jordan and LeBron kind of in their own league. And then I would go with Magic, Bird, and Kobe Bryant. To me, those are the 5 guys that I look at that could do everything on a basketball court, including winning, taking games over, doing it on the defensive end, making teammates better. Those are the 5 guys. I called them the Renaissance men, right? They weren't centers. They weren't point guards. I know Magic was a point guard, yes, but he was a 6'9" point guard. But those guys could do everything on a basketball court. Add up the MVPs and championships those 5 guys won. It's staggering. You can't leave Larry Bird off your top 10 list. I don't know why it continually gets done. I think it may be that the last time people saw him, he was a broken down player. And, no one holds that against Michael Jordan that the last 2 years with the Wizards, that he was still pretty darn good, but he wasn't Michael Jordan.
Well, Sap, I think, kind of playing off of that too, it be a little bit of Larry Bird is sort of out of sight, out of mind in that, Magic Johnson, we still see him on TV all the time. He's on ESPN. True. He owns the Dodgers. He owns the Commanders now. You see him all the time. He's making appearances. Isaiah Thomas is constantly being interviewed. He's in the media all the time. So guys from his era are still, doing media appearances and getting their opinions. And Larry Bird never has been one to, kind of parade around and do the media car wash, regardless of, if there's a movie or documentary coming out about him or the Celtics. That's not ever really been his thing. And so I wonder if part of this is just like, if you're on TV constantly, you're kind of reminding people of your greatness, even if you last played 30 years ago. And Larry Bird, after he finished coaching for a brief tenure with the Indiana Pacers, he sort of faded into the background. Yeah, he was running the things with the Pacers, but he was never on, getting interviewed. And in the past 5 or 6 years, he hasn't really worked for them in any capacity other than like a goodwill ambassador. And so you just don't really see him all that often, Sap. Whereas guys, like I said, like you still see Magic Johnson on a monthly basis on ESPN. He will be there at some point, showing up, doing basketball commentary, talking about, now that he just bought the Commanders, he's talking about football. You see him all the time. So it's hard to forget about Magic Johnson. And maybe just the fact that Larry Bird isn't constantly in front of your eyeballs, people are forgetting that about how great he was and how great he was compared to some of his contemporaries that are being listed on this list. Like it's not a matter of, okay, you just look at the numbers. Sometimes it's a matter of, all right, who's the first guy that's popping into my head? Oh yeah, Magic Johnson. I saw him on TV last week. All right, in Shaq's case, I'm sure he sees him all the time. In person. They probably hang out in similar circles. I don't think Larry Bird's hanging out in any of these NBA alumnus circles. I think he's pretty content keeping to himself. That's sort of just his personality has always been different.
Yeah, he's living in Indiana. He probably fishes 3 times a week for all we know. Like, he's a recluse, to say the least. And sometimes after a player retires, their legend either grows or diminishes. And I think that's the case with Elgin Baylor and Jerry West. They were teammates. Baylor never won a championship. West did win one championship. But I think if you look at the two players, you can make a case that Baylor was the slightly better player. But because Jerry West went on and became arguably the greatest executive in NBA history, and Elgin Baylor was constantly at the draft
Arguably the
lottery,
worst. Yeah, arguably the worst.
Always representing the LA Clippers at the draft lottery, and picking Michael Olowokandi in 1998. And if they had the first overall pick the year before, they would have ended up with Tim Duncan. He just was unfortunate. But as an executive, not really successful. But let's not forget, he was also working for Donald Sterling when Jerry West was working for the Buss family. A little bit of difference in terms of ownership there. So, yeah, sometimes that's exactly what happens, that you look at a player and 20, 30 years after they retire, one of their legends continues to grow and the other one diminishes because what's happened since they retired till that period of time. I don't
well,
get it. I don't.
There's an HBO show, Winning Time, about the Lakers. Jerry West is a main character in that show, even though it's post his playing career. And Elgin Baylor was not even mentioned in that show. So,
West was an executive with the team, though. So that's why he's.
But I'm saying it's just continuing to build his, aura and his legend. He's
the freaking logo.
Yeah,
right?
He is.
And Elgin Baylor to me is the most overlooked great player in the history of the sport, along with Moses Malone. And apparently now Larry Bird, who can't make anyone's top 10 list. So, like those three guys, it's like, just look at the numbers. And if you saw them play, there were moments that they were the best player in basketball. I mean, before Bird ascended to becoming the best player in basketball, it was Moses Malone who won 3 MVPs in a 4-year period. It was Elgin Baylor who, had set the playoff scoring record at 61 points. And he did it, by the way, in regulation. Jordan broke it with 63 in double overtime. So, I'm not going to die on that hill and say that Jordan needed 10 more minutes of action to break Elgin Baylor's record. I got to talk to Casey Jones quite a bit in the 80s, covering the Celtics. All he ever talked about was Elgin Baylor. And Casey Jones was a great defensive player. He goes, he was the one guy no one could stop. Like, he was just bigger, stronger, faster, more skilled.
Tommy Heinsohn said the same thing whenever he had the chance.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody leaves him off the list. But the Bird one is, look, Shaq entered the NBA in 1992. He was born in 1971 or 72. He got to see Larry Bird's career. It's not like he didn't see it. Like, was it just a mental slip up, or is it just a case of, the last couple of years he wasn't quite what he was? Well, neither was Michael Jordan. So I don't get that part. And look, this is coming from someone who saw Larry Bird's entire career. I'm not a Celtics honk. I'm not. But that man deserves to be on every top 10 list, no matter what the criteria is.
Well, I mean, in SAP, like Iverson, Isaiah Thomas, Karl Malone, all on the list. Larry Bird has more championships than those guys combined.
Right.
And Iverson won MVP, 2 MVPs for Karl Malone. Larry Bird has 3. Isaiah Thomas didn't win an MVP.
Yeah.
It doesn't make, by any measure, it doesn't make sense.
No, it really doesn't. I mean, the accomplishments, again, 8 straight years finishing first or second in MVP voting. Like, that's really never been done. Even as great as LeBron is, there's a couple of 3rd or 4th place finishes in there. Like, LeBron should have more than 4 MVPs. Jordan should have more than 5. We know that. But Larry Bird for 8 years was either the best or second best player in the league. He went to 5 finals, won 3 of them. So, I mean, I don't know what more he was supposed to accomplish.
And I get, like, okay, I think you could make a case. I don't agree with it for Curry or Tim Duncan. If you really wanted to put him ahead of Bird, if you had, a big agenda, I think you could make a case. Again, I don't think so.
More titles if you want to go that route, but
not Iverson, Isaiah Thomas, and Karl Malone.
No, or Tiny Archibald. I love Tiny Archibald. He was sensational, but come on.
Yeah, I don't understand. And obviously Shaq's going to put himself on the list. And if you want to say he's building a roster, okay, Larry obviously didn't play center. And so, if you're talking about just building a roster, but like, I don't see a list that makes sense where Shaq is ahead of Larry Bird.
No, I don't either. One more championship, and man, for 3 to 5 years, he was as dominant as any player since Will Chamberlain, right? But again, he didn't have the longest peak, shall we say, where Bird's peak was about 8 years. I have Shaq at number 10. I've kind of revised the list. I always do. I play around with it. I had Steph at number 10, and now I have Shaq at number 10 because, I mean, again, he was just more dominant than Steph Curry. And look, if it's a tiebreaker, give me the 7'1", 325-pound guy who just physically dominated the league and won 3 straight championships and was clearly the best player on the court in all 3 of those finals, where Steph Curry did have Kevin Durant to help him win 2 titles and didn't even win the MVP. Before he had Kevin Durant, it was Andre Iguodala. So, yeah, I'll put Shaq at number 10, but I just don't get it. I don't get it. And I'm not trying to be flip here because the guy was white or is white. He hasn't passed on. Are people just not giving him credit? I mean, even Dennis Rodman recently came out with some stupid statement that, yeah, he would be just average today.
I think he said he'd be in Europe or something like that.
Yeah,
he'd be playing in Europe.
Yeah. I mean, come on. I mean, Jokic is being compared to Larry Bird, right? And again, it's always kind of comical when you compare the white guy to another white guy. But if Larry Bird played today, he'd average in the low 30s because the prominence of the three-point shot. I mean, he did play when the three-point shot was there, but it wasn't as big a deal as it is now. Larry Bird taking 10 three-pointers a game. He'd hit 4 of them. You know, he'd average in the high 20s, low 30s. And, oh, by the way, he was a great rebounder and a great passer. He did everything.
He'd be one of those, the 50, 40, 90 guys that teams salivate over,
you know. He's done it. He did it.
And
he did it when
also,
it wasn't fashionable.
Also rebound and get assists. So, you know,
he was a traffic rebounder. He played. That's why when I talk.
So
about
what?
Larry
He'd be
Bird,
an efficient Russell Westbrook, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, he'd average a triple double or close to it, while shooting 50% from the floor, 40% from 3, and wouldn't have anywhere near the turnovers, and he'd be winning championships. And again, I call him a forward. I mean, I know there's always this debate: who's the greatest small forward ever? It's LeBron. But yes. LeBron's also a guy that's kind of positionless because he handles the ball so much. You can make a case LeBron is, Magic Johnson 2.0, a better version of Magic Johnson. Bird was a forward. He was too good a rebounder to just be a small forward, and he was too good a passer and a scorer to be a power forward. He was a forward, and he was phenomenal.
Yeah, well, now you know what they're calling. The NBA is just saying front court, back court, period.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. Except for you could even go further and you could say ball handler, not ball handler. Because sometimes, like you said, the forward, the small forward, power forward, whatever, traditionally, they're bringing up the ball. Kevin Durant brings up the ball plenty. He's 7 feet tall.
Jokic is a center. He handles the ball more than anyone for Denver. It's a different sport right now. Yeah, the Bird part of it, I don't get it. Like, someone has to put him on that all-time top 10 list. I'd like to hear what Magic Johnson would say, because I know Magic would have Larry Bird on there.
Yeah,
without question.
Definitely.
He wouldn't even be a debate.
No, it is strange that he's the person that's sort of the forgotten man. I think with Dr. J's list, there's a lot of people that you can say, okay, well, I'd put him ahead of Karl Malone or certainly Tiny Archibald, but the Larry Bird certainly is the most glaring omission, and I think it's fair to also say Kobe Bryant was a very glaring omission to me. Tim Duncan, I have over Kobe Bryant in my personal top 10 list, so I think Tim Duncan was a very glaring omission in Dr. J's list as well. But I'm a huge Tim Duncan, I guess, truther maybe.
Me
supporter.
Too. He was
same thing with him, Sap, is that like he's disappeared because he doesn't like media that much, and so like the people just like forget about how freaking dominant he was.
Here's the thing about Tim Duncan and Larry Bird: the 2 worst dressed superstars in the history of the NBA.
Very true. Very true. That might be a big part of it.
Not fashion icons, to say the least. I think they both shop at Target or Marshalls or Walmart or something like that. They're very, very similar guys. Bird was more fiery than Tim Duncan, but they were great teammates, leaders, did everything necessary to win, versatile, coachable, all of that.
Yeah. And well, before we finish up, Sap, there is some more NBA news, not necessarily on the court, but on the sidelines, as we have a new number 1 announcing team for ESPN, and we'll be hearing them during the ABC NBA Finals broadcasts in the playoffs. Out, as we already knew, was Jeff Van Gundy. Also out this week, Mark Jackson. And so that left just Mike Breen, and he is going to be joined by Doris Burke, who is being elevated from the number 2 team to the number 1 team, and Doc Rivers, who is rejoining the media after a lengthy absence. And that is your number 1 ESPN commentary booth. Sap, how do you feel about that trio?
Well, Jeff Van Gundy to me is the best basketball analyst, college or professional, ready, willing, and able to criticize players, coaches, officials, the league as a whole. I wonder if there was pushback from the league to ESPN that Jeff Van Gundy is criticizing us too much. You have to move on from him. I mean, ESPN put out some message that they were concerned that Van Gundy would get back into coaching, that they didn't want to extend him or they wanted to let him go at this point and move on from him. That's an idiotic statement. I mean, Fox had Sean Payton work for them for 1 year, knowing full well he was probably going to coach the next year. And here he is back with the Denver Broncos. I think that Van Gundy is outstanding. I also liked Mark Jackson because I thought they worked really well together. And generally the way these three-man boots work is you have the play-by-play guy, and look, Mike Breen's as good as it gets. You have the former coach and you have the former player. And that's where I think it really works. As far as this new booth, I thought Doc Rivers was really good at this when he did it, 15, 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's been a while now.
It has been a while. He's a charismatic guy. Everyone likes Doc Rivers. He's still going to be collecting $7-8 million a year for the next couple of years from the Philadelphia 76ers. So good for Doc. I do wonder about his voice. He's got that raspy, hoarse voice.
Yeah, it's only gotten worse since he's
gotten way worse. So I don't know if that's going to grate on people. If maybe it's going to be a difficult listen. Doris Burke's good. She's solid. I think she does a nice job.
I think she was exposed a little as she's gotten more prominent and gotten more high profile and more repetition, that she knows the game. Obviously, I'm not going to criticize her on that, but I do think that she tends to play favorites with people that or teams that maybe she's a little bit closer to. And
she loves the Celtics. She loves
the Sixers. She loves the Sixers.
She loves. Well, she loves Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown and Marcus Smart too. She likes a lot of teams.
I think she's fine. Would I say that should be? I don't think that she's good enough to be in this role necessarily. I think that she's broken so many barriers as a female commentator, and that's tremendous. But I think some women have passed her by now. Candace Parker, I am just continuously, and she's still playing, so she can't really do it full time. I think she's tremendous. I think she's fantastic. But I think, Sap, ultimately, and you and I like to dissect the media stuff of this. Mike Breen is so good that he'll make it work. Sometimes
you and I could sit next to Mike Breen and the broadcast would be good, right?
Yeah, because it's the same thing as like Ernie Johnson with the TNT show. Like, they're just pros, and they've been doing it for so long, and they have the personality to do it. Like, ESPN could throw two random people with him, and it would be fine because he's going to be the lead voice, and he knows how to prod his co-hosts, the color commentators to get the most out of them. So I think he'll do a good job.
Let me say this about Doris Burke. I think she's going to be in a better role now because she's now part of a 3-person booth rather than working with Mark Jones, who I don't like at all. I think he's rather weak as a play-by-play guy. I think he's forced. So you had Doris Burke working with Mark Jones, and now she's working with Mike Breen and Doc Rivers. So I think that's going to work a lot better. I just wonder what's going to happen with Stan Van Gundy. Can TNT reach out and hire him? Or is the league saying, no, we don't want him on our national broadcast anymore? I don't think he would sit in studio with Barkley, Kenny Smith, Shaq, and Ernie Johnson because you don't want to disrupt that. And I think Draymond Green is the heir apparent once Shaq or Barkley retire. Once Draymond retires as well, he'll slide into that role, being an ex-player. As far as Stan Van Gundy, could
Stan or Jeff?
Jeff. I'm talking about Jeff. I'm sorry. With Jeff Van Gundy, could you put Jeff and Stan on the same broadcast team with Kevin Harlan? It might be interesting, but it would also be a bit verbose because, Stan Van Gundy never shuts up. Jeff Van Gundy's the better of the two. He was better as a coach and better as a broadcaster, but they do like to have one ex-player in there. So that's, something we do. I want to hear more of Jeff Van Gundy. I don't want him silenced next year. I wonder if any players push back either. And I'm going to throw one out there, my favorite player of all time. I wonder if LeBron James, pushed back and said that this guy's too critical even of LeBron. I mean, we've seen many Laker games where Jeff Van Gundy will criticize LeBron James for not getting back on defense or not doing the right thing. I mean, he's the one national broadcaster that will go there. I wonder if some of the players pushed back and said, we don't want this guy doing the games anymore.
Yeah, and I think some of the players don't like that Barkley criticizes them all the time, but TNT just laughs in their face. If they're saying, okay, you guys get rid of Barkley, TNT would say, no, that is not happening. He makes us way too much money. He's the next
player, right? So I think that there's a different dynamic there.
Yeah, and as far as Mark Jackson goes, Sap, I still believe he really wants to get back into coaching. I think he probably in his heart of hearts thinks he's the reason that the Warriors were able to to reach that next level and become this championship team, even though it was under Steve Kerr's watch and not his. And I think some teams would give him a look, though. Everything that happened internally that you heard about with him as the coach of the Warriors seems to have rubbed a lot of teams the wrong way when they've been going through their interview process. So I don't think we necessarily know all the details, but I think his future more likely lies on the less in the media side and more on the basketball side of things is what I would imagine him to pursue. And maybe Van Gundy, Jeff Van Gundy does want to get back into coaching.
True.
It has been a long time now. His last stint was with the Rockets when Yao Ming was still playing, and it's been quite some time. But I mean, I would not be surprised at all if he takes a year off and then next year he is one of, if not the most in demand, head coaching candidate. So that certainly could happen. But for now, I do think it's going to take a little bit of time to get used to, this new crew. As we've been so used to Mark Jackson and Jeff Van Gundy and Mike Breen, they've been, doing it for a long time together. And so there's going to be some growing pains. But like I said, that's the reason they got rid of Van Gundy and Mark Jackson and kept Breen is because you have to keep the play-by-play guy. The color people are replaceable. A great play-by-play person like the Celtics have had for 45 years, and Mike Gorman, who's retiring this year, not replaceable. They've seen it when they've tried to move Scal to being the play-by-play person.
Right.
You can't do it. So Mike Breen is the straw that stirs the drink there, Sap.
It's like having a great quarterback, right? You change the receivers, the offensive line, you have the great quarterback, you let him do his thing.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's key. He can make, this is not the Mike Breen ball washing hour, but I mean, he is fantastic at what he does. And when you have somebody at that level, they can elevate other people. So even though it's been a while for Doc Rivers and Doris Burke may not be everybody's favorites, he'll figure out a way to make it work. So I'm interested to hear it. And I do think Doc Rivers has a great personality, but I agree with you, Sap. I'm worried that is his voice just going to go at one point during a big playoff game, and it's just going to be a 2-person booth at that point?
Yeah, I mean, that may be a difficult listen, right? When Doc's maybe the voice gets that way because he's so vocal during games that when he meets with the press afterwards, he's just forced from yelling so much, and maybe doing a broadcast, it won't be quite as pronounced.
Yeah, so we'll see, but that's what we got for you today here on the Pick and Roll NBA podcast with Jet and Sap. Thanks for full press coverage. Go check out their website. Check out our social medias at JohnSap25, at Jet Stryer. You can vote in Sap's poll about which of those all-time teams you think would win between the generations of top 10 players. Let us know who your top 10 is. Tweet at Sap or me and let us know. And you can find the show wherever podcasts are found. So thanks for doing that, and we will talk to you later. See you, everybody.